I'm here at Blackfriars in Newcastle, and a lot of the local people probably don't know what all this actually is, even though they enjoy it on a nice sunny day like today. Well, this was a huge friary. In fact, it was possibly the biggest of the Dominican friaries anywhere. In Britain, the Dominicans seem to have built particularly large friaries, and this was, we think, the largest of them. And this was the grand church. This is the nave here, and you can see either side these great big square boxes on the ground. They mark where once there were huge pillars that held up a vast ceiling that was above me, and it's all gone. Now, the Dominicans arrived in Britain in 1221, and they spread out really quickly, and they built friaries all across the land. And this one was founded in 1239. And as I say, it was a pretty big one. And look at just this huge church that I'm in here. And the entrance was probably here. And it's an internal entrance. This doesn't go out onto the streets of the city. No, this was for the friars of the friary here to make their way through their own internal path into this grand church. So why isn't it here anymore? Why isn't it still standing? Well, there was a chap called Henry VIII who decided that he'd had enough of all this being Catholic stuff. He'd quite like to get away from that. So he formed his own church, the Church of England, and these Catholics are lovely and rich, aren't they? I think I'll take some of that. And so the wealth from here was snatched by the king, and the place fell into disrepair. And this church, well, there was no more use for it, so over the years it fell down. Now, this was once huge. Heading off in that sort of direction were walls enclosing a big area, big garden, and it included a lot of fish ponds with what are called leats. Leats are channels between the various artificial fish ponds. Now, if for a third of the year you're eating fish because you're a Catholic, you're going to need lots of fish. So you dig huge artificial fish ponds, stock them with fish, and just as you might move your cattle from one field to another by opening the gate, well, they had leats, artificial channels that guided the fish through sluices and so forth into other ponds. And this was big business. They produced fish on an industrial scale. So this was one of the sources of wealth for the friary. And the Dominicans did get quite rich. By the way, I call them Dominicans. They were normally referred to as Blackfriars. And there's a perfectly good reason for that, because you saw a friar, and if he was wearing black, he was probably a Blackfriar, one of the Dominican order. They were color-coded in those days, and there were others called grey friars. I'll leave you to imagine what color they wore. Anyway, there were some sailors from Newcastle who raided Dunfermline, stole a bell from the Franciscans, brought it back here, auctioned it, the Dominicans bought it and proudly used it. And the Franciscans were not terribly happy about that, but it makes a good story. Another story is that the reason that the Toonami, the supporters of the Magpies, the supporters of the local football team here, Newcastle United, the reason they wear black and white stripes is because the Blackfriars, they had a black outer garment and a white inner garment, black and white. I don't actually believe that, to be honest, because they wore that uniform all around Europe, so why should that have become such a big thing in Newcastle? But it's one of the many tales they tell to establish the authenticity and vintage of the black and white stripe on the Newcastle players. So Henry VIII came along and he took all the wealth, and this place fell into rack and ruin for a bit. And you can see now this U-shaped bit, that's all we've got still standing of the original buildings, though they do at least come up to something like the original height. And there was perhaps another courtyard further that way, and that's all gone. And it, for 300 years, was the headquarters of a lot of guilds. So you have 300 years as a friary, then a little bit of a hiatus, what with the Reformation and everything. Then you have 300 years of guilds, and then it falls into rack and ruin again. In the 1960s, there were people even suggesting bulldozing the whole lot and replacing it with modern housing. Yikes, well, that didn't happen. Fortunately, people preserved this, and then in the modern period it becomes a restaurant.
When the Newcastle town walls got built, the gardens of the friars were cut in half, but it was all right because they got permission from the king to have a door through the fortifications so that they could get to the outer part of the gardens without having to climb over. Newcastle's town walls today, though no longer complete, are at least original, unlike York's, which are rebuilt. Most of these buildings are based on those built in 1248 after a fire destroyed the first friary. They were paid for by Newcastle's mayor, and the extravagance was considered too great for Dominicans with their vows of poverty, and the prior, the top-ranking friar, was consequently dismissed. The guilds moved in after the friars left, and in all 9 guild headquarters were established in the upper stories of these buildings. These included the butchers, the bakers and brewers, the tailors, the cordwainers, because we all love a bit of cordwaining, the fullers and dyers, the tanners, saddlers, skinners and glovers, and the smiths. And heaven knows they were miserable. Not all, but many of the guild's crests survive on the outside of the buildings. These join the many clues to how things have been chopped and changed over the years. A staircase once went up to what is now a balcony. There was something, a big door or window perhaps, under that arch. Some of the guild rooms survive, but alas I didn't get to see all of them, but they opened up this one for me. The furniture, I reckon, is mostly Victorian. Today this is used as a tasting room. Not bad, eh? Across the way, some modern architects have at least made a nod to the medieval context of their new buildings. The ground floors became almshouses, housing given for the use of those having fallen on hard times, widows and the like. The last of these was still in use in 1951. So, were the friars all models of piety? Well, perhaps, if you consider that these men had volunteered to own nothing, to have just one simple meal a day for much of the year, and to pray 8 times a day, including in the middle of the night. That's quite a show of commitment. On the other hand, Edward III did have to pardon one Newcastle Blackfriar for doing a bit of a murder, and Richard II stopped another friar here from receiving a high honour on the grounds that the friar had behaved in a scandalous and impious manner.
And now Blackfriars has become a restaurant, and I'm here with that restaurant's owner, Andy Hook. Thank you so much for joining us. What changes have you made since you've taken over?
So we've been here for 20 years, comparatively small part of Blackfriars history.
Right.
And it was a small restaurant when we arrived here in 2001, so 21 years. We've been here, and we've kind of expanded into different parts of the building.
You have themed nights here with some medieval banquets and the like, sometimes even going as far as putting people in costume.
Yes.
And you serve medieval themed food as well.
Yes, so we have minstrels that come in and play their instruments and give us a little kind of dance and a jig.
Right.
and so on.
Okay, and trenches instead of plates.
And we have wooden trenches. You could have had bread trenches. And then we also have medieval lectures in here twice a year. We have an initiative called Eat Medieval,
right.
And that sprung up, originated during the pandemic, where we were cooking online with people from across the world, and now we're back doing it in-house, where we cook food from the period, trying to piece together those recipes as authentically as we can. The chances that a cook would have been able to read is unlikely. So even when we do find recipes, and I put in inverted commas because they're just vague direction with no measurements or anything, what they would have intended for is hard to really understand.
Right, so a lot of the research has to be done by the taste, I suppose. You put in so much of some ingredient, and after a while you just think, no, they can't put that much in, it just tastes wrong.
Yes.
So you've got to use a cook's judgment to a degree.
The first cookbook as we know it was put together for or by Richard II's cooks.
All right.
Around the end of the 14th century, so around 1390, we get what is as similar to a conventional cookbook as we know it today.
Right.
And it's called the form of cookery, and it's widely regarded as the first English cookbook, a collection of medieval recipes.
Right.
And it gives you a little bit more detail.
So is that English cookbook as in it's a cookbook and it's in English, or it's of what it was genuinely English food and not foreign food?
Well, in some ways, medieval food was bizarrely very localized but quite global. Global in the sense that it used spices that were brought over by a series of merchants,
Right.
either on land or by sea, across from Indonesia, West Africa, or so on. And they arrived here, and of course they were very expensive by the time they arrived here, and probably lost a huge amount of their pungency.
Right.
So when people say, "Oh, put in 3 tablespoons of ginger or whatever," it's like,
Okay.
well, it probably didn't taste of much at that time. That's probably why they asked for it. But also, everything was very local because the animals, the herbs, the vegetables that you had were very much about what you were growing here.
We have a magnificent arch here, which clearly has some medieval ancestry in it, though I can see some modern, like that stone there is clearly modern.
Yeah.
Its counterpart the other side.
Yes, and so this is the lavatorium. This is where they would have washed their hands,
Right.
and they would have washed their hands.
Oh,
Washing.
we have a bit of a basin here, do we?
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And washing your hands and cleanliness was very much akin to godliness, and it was very important when you entered into any dining hall that you washed your hands, were given a napkin, draped that over your shoulder, and there was quite strict rules about the way that you dined in a medieval kind of setting. You weren't allowed to, for example, pick your nose or scratch your boils or fart or belch or scratch your head or anything like that. So these were all kind of strict things that were written down.
Although the fact that they got written down, and I've seen some of these documents, suggests that they needed to be written down because people used to do those things.
Yes.
You don't have a sign saying no, strictly no, whatever it is, unless that has been a problem at some point in the past.
Yes.
So this wasn't an entranceway then. So this here is a frame to show how important the activity that happened here was.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
this arrangement of a magnificent arch is like a picture frame saying this thing is important, and the important thing is that you wash your hands.
Exactly it. And there's 2 kind of places that you're going to eat here. One is behind here.
Yes.
We have a banquet hall, feasting hall, somewhere where they would have entertained people from the outside. We know, for example, that Henry III spent time here. Edward III spent time here when Edward Balliol came down in 1334 to pay homage to Edward III, and they would have washed their hands here and then entered into the banqueting hall here for probably a largely secular type of service, feasting. But also, you can't see it here because it's behind this fence here, but we've got an entrance which we think would have been into the refectory, which would have been a very different style of eating. The friars would have had a very simple meal. There was great arguments as to whether they should enjoy their food or whether food is just sustenance. Dominicans were a mendicant order, so they were a begging order. They weren't allowed to own anything.
Right.
And I think actually history suggests that they had to work quite hard to keep the Dominicans in check.
Well, I can imagine if they have to eat there and there are kings
yeah.
scoffing themselves on all the really nice stuff in
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
that's just rubbing salt in it.
Yeah, I think so.
Tell us about these herbs in these pots here.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do over a number of years is to try and be self-sufficient in herbs, because herbs were such an important part of the Dominicans' life, both in medicine and culinary.
Right.
And we see references to herbs all the time, and compared with the spices that, as we know, have been brought across half the world, herbs, by definition, were always local. But it was really interesting that they had a much wider variety of herbs than
Right.
we see today in your local supermarket.
Yeah.
So later on, we're going to be cooking with hyssop and southernwood and alecost and so on. You know, things that you just don't
Good
see in
names
the
too.
supermarket. Yeah, great names.
And walnut shells. I see you have quite a few walnut shells in this pot.
Because we've got a walnut tree here.
Ah.
And also
It's huge.
it bears fruit for us throughout the summer. So yeah, we have lavender here, and again we will use these in our bar as well. So we might dry these out to put with the desserts, or we might use them to garnish our cocktails as well. So again,
Right.
there's kind of lots of things where we're trying to give a little bit of a nod to our Dominican heritage and trying to use stuff in our modern day restaurant that people are going to appreciate.
One thing I've heard about lavender is it's one of the supposedly secret flavourings in Coca-Cola.
Well, we'll never know that, will we?
Well, that's a secret that won't be revealed in our lifetimes, but
Yeah.
one day.
Yeah.
It'd be great. No, but I can remember having tasted some Coca-Cola and thinking, is there? Yeah, actually, when you know that there's probably some lavender in there, you can just sort of, if you concentrate, taste it.
Okay, I don't drink Coke very often, but
Neither do I.
Chives! Those are not chives.
This has been a kitchen really for the last 800 years where they would have prepared food. But the friars would have had probably, as I say, a simple meal in silence, maybe a Latin reading to keep their knowledge up and so on.
Just keep the jollity down.
Yeah, no fun.
It was very important. Well, there aren't many kitchens that have been kitchens for 800 years, and I think you could possibly have a plaque here, promising you, kings have washed their hands, possibly in this here basin.
We should ask English Heritage whether we can drill a hole in the wall, but
exactly.
they might say no.
All right, thank you so much for showing me around.
Thanks, Lloyd. Thank you. All right.
Pleasure. Oh, now it occurs to me that some of you might be a little bit hazy as to the difference between monks and friars. It's quite understandable. I mean, they look pretty similar. They've got tonsures, they're members of holy orders, they've got the robes, they've got the belt, perhaps made out of rope, maybe a holy cross or something like that. Man of God. It's easy mistake to make. But back in the day, in the medieval period, people were very clear as to the distinction between monks and friars. Monks were the hardcore cases. They had joined monastic orders, examples of monastic orders now appearing on your screen, and they would be cloistered away in monasteries, perhaps far out in the country, and they would have for their company other monks, or possibly some of them would be living in individual cells and they'd hardly even see the other monks all that much. And they would take some really serious vows. Yeah, they might take vows of silence, for instance. That's a bit of a biggie to commit to long term, I think you'll agree. And they would devote their days to contemplation and prayer and God, and then more contemplation and then more prayer and that sort of thing. Friars, on the other hand, though they looked generally the same, and they were also members of holy orders, but they joined mendicant orders, examples of mendicant orders appearing now on your screen. They would also take vows of things like poverty and chastity, but they were far more worldly. They would be expected to go out into the ordinary world and to interact with ordinary people. So an ordinary man in Newcastle would see that the friars of Blackfriars wandering about, going about their business, doing some shopping and whatever it was. And they were expected to go out and spread the word of God, raise money for charity and all that sort of thing. So they were not such hardcore cases, and they weren't cloistered away from mainstream society. Women could join these orders as well. They could become nuns and live in abbeys, or they could become poor clares in mendicant orders and live in priories. Although nuns were a little bit different, the poor clares were a little bit different in that whereas friars were expected to go out and mix with the ordinary folk, the poor clares, they weren't. They were actually expected to be fairly cloistered away. So there you go, women are different. Anyway, if you are interested in knowledge, in general, then you might be interested in my sponsor, Wondrium. Now, my generous sponsor can be found by going to wondrium.com/Lindybeige, where you will find details of a free trial offer. And if you follow those details, you'll be able to sample the delights of this huge website that has thousands, oh yes, literally thousands of academic lectures on it by highly qualified people from august universities from around the world, though mostly Eastern America, and they talk on all sorts of subjects. So you're bound to find something that interests you. You might, for instance, be interested in food, cultural and culinary history, which is one of their lecture courses. And I was watching episode 7, which was about the Indian cuisine. And they had to cover quite a lot of history there. And our lecturer, let's have a quick look at our lecturer. There he is, you see, bit of parallel waving, and then into a front interlace. Oh yeah, the general standard of cradle work on the site is pretty good, and this man is no exception. So he was talking about the Aryans who invaded the Indus Valley. Oh, I should say the Aryans, of course. These are not the blonde Germanic Aryans that certain people went on and on about in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. No, these are the, if you like, the actual Aryans, the real Aryans, who were from somewhere around Iran, and that's not a coincidence because Iran is land of the Aryans. That's what the word means. Anyway, they invaded in all directions, but a lot of them went towards the Indus Valley, which is now northwest India and parts of Pakistan and places like that, and they took over the rather mysterious Indus Valley civilization that was there, and we've only known about for about a century, and we can't read much of their writing. It's an amazing thing, a big, very, very old civilization that we know so little about. It's rather exciting, really. Anyway, and they influenced its cooking, and so they were great herdsmen. They had great big herds of cattle which they would eat quite happily, it seems, and they would also milk, and they could make butter from the milk. But butter goes off in a very hot climate, so they developed a technology to clarify it into something called ghee, which even today is part of mainstream Indian cooking. Anyway, you find out all about that sort of stuff, history of cooking, and of course you can't tell the history of cooking without telling the history of loads of other things as well, technology and the movement of people and ideas and all the rest of it. So there you go. It's the nature of knowledge. One thing leads to another, down to a rabbit hole. It's all fascinating. You'll love it. Wondrium. Giles, what do we have in this pot?
This pot we have a number of different herbs. We have southernwood, not one that's very commonly used in a culinary
I mistook that for dill. So this is southernwood.
So this is southernwood, yeah. It's an artemisia related to wormwood, so very, very bitter.
Right.
If you want it, I wouldn't taste it, but just have a smell of that.
Oh.
Sort of, so wormwood is what absinthe is made out of, so it's that kind of level of bitterness.
Yes. I recognise the smell, but I can't name it. But it's nice, actually. Yeah, it's a little bit perfumey.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, beautifully fragrant, and it softens and does interesting things when you cook it, when you pound it with vinegar, which is what the medieval recipes that we have say.
Right.
This is another very common one. This is costmary or ale cost. Again, we don't really use it these days. It's got a lovely lemony flavour and this beautiful sawtooth edge. So this was again used quite commonly in cooking. One of the ubiquitous sauces of the Middle Ages is the green sauce. That's the kind of tomato.
It's a little bit minty.
It is minty.
Yeah.
So
Yes, in fact, I would have. Yes, like a chewing gum mint,
Yeah.
spearmint,
Yeah, it is,
sort of.
yeah.
Yeah.
That one's used to flavour ale in the period as well. So
Right.
quite often hops weren't used. Hops really come into beer making in the late 14th century, 15th century. So before
Right.
that, there's not a hoppy flavour. So these sort of herbs really fill out the flavour there. But we also have rosemary here and lavender. But the green sauce, which is a kind of mixture of herbs, and we might have a go at cooking one of those sorts of sauces a bit later.
Right.
This is kind of ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. It's a sort of tomato ketchup. Everybody has a green sauce. It goes really nicely with fish,
Right.
also with chicken dishes. It's got a kind of lineal descendant in chimichurri.
All right. So back in the day, you think everyone would have said, "Ah, my mum's green sauce."
Exactly.
They would do that.
It's exactly that.
Yeah. So this is hyssop.
Yeah, this is blue hyssop. There are a number of different varieties. Pink and blue are the main ones. So this again is one of the herbs in the herb palette of the Middle Ages, along with rosemary that we have here,
Rosemary, yes,
and
fairly familiar.
sage and lavender. All of these, of course, have medicinal uses as well, and there's a whole genre of text, the herbal, which talks about how you might use hyssop in this case if you've got a chesty cough, and then there's other recipes or other medicinal recipes. And that's a very interesting thing about medieval culinary recipes. There's almost none that don't occur in a context or in a book or a collection where there are also medicinal recipes, either for humans or for animals. So
you should use all these ingredients because they're good for you.
well, it's a very interesting question. Yeah, so the kind of boundary between gastronomy and medicalised food is quite a fluid one in the period. In the 12th century, the sources that we're looking at, we think, me and my colleague Faith Wallace from McGill University think this is on the cusp of gastronomic.
But there was a widespread belief, wasn't there, in the 14th century that green leafy vegetables were bad for you and you shouldn't be eating cabbage and the
So
like.
they have different qualities. So there are different sorts of ways of thinking about medieval medicine. We can go down the humoral route. The sources that we're looking at are humorally, so this is your balance between black bile, red bile, which are related to the elements, and we're all composed of all four elements. Actually, humorally, those sources are completely useless. They're neutral. So we think there's another medicalisation going on, which is that these sources are for encouraging appetite. So if you've lost your appetite from being ill, then this will
Okay, so
restore
someone's lost
it.
his appetite, and the way to get him eating it properly again is just to give him nice stuff.
Nice
he'll
stuff,
like.
exactly. And tangy acidic sources. Now those are pretty standard throughout the Middle Ages. That what the aristocracy, because that's where we have most of the recipes from, really seem to like these sharp sauces. Things get a bit sweeter as we go through the Middle Ages, so sugar cane starts to emerge in the 13th century, becomes very popular in the 14th and 15th centuries. Again,
but still expensive.
still expensive. This is elite, so the recipes we have are really for the elite, either kind of aristocrats with their big houses in the countryside, big noble households, or elites within the cities.
So people are publishing these medical texts.
Yeah.
They may have some financial vested interest in suggesting that people eat lots of expensive stuff, do you think?
Well, maybe. That's a good question. Certainly there's a reliance on, the spice trade is long distance trade.
Yep.
Most major towns will have a spicery. So we know there was a spice guild in Newcastle by the mid 13th century.
Right.
But these are spices that are coming from Indonesia, from the Malay archipelago, from India. They're sort of sent by chains of merchants. So we have Arabic merchants operating out of Basra in particular. That's a great big entrepot for these, and then these get passed over. European merchants pick them up on the Black Sea across the Silk Route, or they pick them up Alexandria, and then they enter the great big trading cities, Venice and so forth.
Right, and there seems to be this rough approximation that the further something has come, the more wonderful it must flipping be, and therefore the more amazing its medicinal powers. Nutmeg, when it was first discovered on some tiny island in the middle of nowhere, was a cure for approximately everything.
Yes, that's right. And that you will find the same ingredients in medicinal recipes as you do in gastronomic. So again, that crossover. But yes, the kind of exoticism exists too. Although there are voices in the Middle Ages. There's a late 12th, early 13th century author called Gerald of Wales who says, well, of course, in India, what we think of as exotic spices are just normal.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of realisation of that.
Oh yeah, people
generality.
had common sense.
Yeah.
Spearmint again. This is ale cost, yeah?
That's right. Tons of ale cost, not just used for culinary stuff, as we said. This is also for beer, and they made a lot of ale and beer. Records of the Dukes of Northumbria's household. They're making gallons of this stuff a week. We don't actually have very many recipes for medieval beer. We have recipes for curious beers, strong beers, spiced beers, but actually it's so ubiquitous. It's a bit like bread. Everybody knows
Right,
how
so they
to make
assume
ale.
that you can make a basic beer, but this
Yeah.
is so the expensive, exotic
Exactly.
beer. Buy our herbs. Buy our herbs.
And the recipe collections that we do have are very interesting across the Middle Ages. So a lot of the recipe collections really start emerging from the late 13th century. In French, in Middle English, in German. We also have them in Catalan, in Castilian. There are some Arabic cookbooks from the south of modern-day Spain.
And are these all very different, or do you read them all and go, oh, they're all about the same?
So there are some elements that are the same. So one of the surprising things about medieval European culture is its homogeneity, that things like the green sauce will be found everywhere. Of course, there are then local variants. German food has some quite distinct ingredients. They use carp, for example, a lot.
They still do in parts
They
of
do,
Christmas
exactly.
lunch
Big
in
Christmas feast.
southern Germany, I
Yeah.
believe. And apparently it's awful. Every British person I know who's eaten carp for Christmas in Germany said it's terrible.
I haven't actually eaten it myself, but
Okay.
carp's not really introduced into England until the 15th century, so you get
Right.
those sort of regional variants. There's obviously a big difference between northern foodstuffs and Mediterranean,
Right.
and you can see that comparing the Catalan cookbooks to the English cookbooks, for example. By far and away the largest number of recipe collections is German. but this is because of a 15th century vogue really for house books, day books,
Right.
guides to how to run your household, which people copy, they make their own sorts of versions of, and these always include recipe collections as well. So we have a huge number of German collections of recipes,
Right.
and then in Middle English and French are probably the next most dominant.
Okay, so it's not that the Germans were more interested in cooking, it's just that more of it got written down.
More of it got written down, more survives
Right.
in these day books.
And the Mediterranean, we think of a Mediterranean style of cooking that's garlic and it's tomatoes and it's olive oil, etc. There are certain key ingredients. They had no tomatoes.
No tomatoes, but they've got everything else there. So
Right.
garlic and olive oil in particular. They don't really, so southern cooking doesn't really use butter until about the 1420s, and then you can see it entering Italian cooking, and
Right.
it's there. Butter is used quite commonly in northern cuisine, so in German and English
So do you think
recipes.
someone familiar with modern Mediterranean cooking would recognise a Mediterranean influence even back in the Mediterranean?
Absolutely. So if you look at something like the Saint-Souvi collection, which is the earliest Catalan collection, it's got a dead ringer for crema catalana.
Right.
It's got carrot purees, it's got leek purees, which look very much like modern day Catalan dishes.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot of continuity, I think, and that's one of those untold stories about medieval cuisine. It's one of the world's greatest cuisines, but I think the continuities are very interesting to modern day.
Okay, so to perhaps more, a greater degree than a lot of people would think, we're still influenced by a medieval diet.
In some senses, yeah, and the medieval diet also speaks to a lot of modern day concerns. Yes, there's the long distance trade with the spices, but it's also a society that has access to very fresh meat. So it's one of those myth busters. They don't use spices to disguise bad meat, they use spices because they like spices.
Spices are good.
Exactly. They do eat lots of vegetables, so up to the 14th century, the peasant diet is basically vegetarian, lots of pulses, legumes. After the 14th century, there seems to be a shift that there is more meat being eaten, but that's probably a product of plague and Black Death and a shift in the labour market, but also a shift in taste as well, with people aping noble households.
Right, so after the Great Plague, the average man got comparatively richer.
Labour is at a premium.
Selling your labour, you could get a lot more money for it.
Yeah.
And this didn't lead to wild inflation that pushed meat outside the
No,
means of
I mean,
most
it's more difficult to find the source material. That's always our issue. But you can do an awful lot with archaeology and with sort of revisiting accounts. So there's some recent research on Anglo-Saxon feasting. Feasting isn't that common because it's extremely expensive to do. By the time we get into the sort of 12th and 13th centuries, when we have more evidence, you can see noble households are spending 20, 25, 30% of their income on food and entertaining. So this is a society that puts a serious amount of money into this side of its life.
I suppose a lot of entertaining would have been in the form of laying on food.
Yes, exactly. So if you don't have guests, then it seems to be a more modest fare is put for the household. But if guests are arriving, if that's the king, for example, we have menu cards from the king who visits noble households, and the courses are quite remarkable and extraordinary.
Right, you said earlier that they had a greater access to fresh meat and a wider variety of meat, but you're still talking about the posh folk. The peasants are not eating dolphins, are they?
No, they're not. but dolphins are being eaten, actually. We have some excavation at Durham Cathedral, in fact. So we were excavating underneath the great kitchen and discovered a whole bunch of bones, including porpoise bones, which probably came from the Lindisfarne Friary. So that is being eaten.
Right, well, strict Catholic doctrine, you're not supposed to eat fish every single day.
Nope.
Not on Fridays, famously, but actually Wednesdays you're supposed to stay off. And is it Sundays as well?
So there's different sorts of regulation which are... there's different sorts of regulation which are followed differently in different periods and at different times. So if you're quite pious, you do some things. But
right, but you're supposed to eat fish, for instance.
It's about
and fish includes what? Beaver, for instance. That's a type of fish, isn't it?
Beaver tail.
Beaver tail.
Yeah.
Oh, and you can't eat the rest of the beaver.
No, the rest of the beaver is clearly meat, but the
beaver
tail.
Have to eat that on
the beaver
next
tail
day.
is fish.
Okay. Rabbit, I think it's essentially a fish, isn't it? And ducks, they swim on water. They're fish.
Yeah. So I don't know actually.
Well, as I understand it, you're supposed to eat fish.
For about a third of the year.
Yeah,
so.
but they, for their own convenience, perhaps, broadened the definition of fish a lot more
Yeah,
widely
you
than the way we think of it today. But I didn't know about the beaver's tail. Okay, so it's only the beaver's tail is fish.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're right, the definitions get kind of moved around. It's about a third of the year is a fish.
Yeah,
A
it's
fish
not
day.
just Fridays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the recipe collection, so in the bigger English ones, you'll see alternative versions. So pies on a fish day, pies on a meat day, and different ingredients accordingly.
Right, we're going to cook some stuff. What are we going to cook?
So we're going to cook a recipe from the 12th century. So this is from the earliest collection of recipes we know in the Middle Ages. So since the Roman Empire,
Right.
1170, this is where it is.
Okay. In the world or in Britain?
In medieval Europe. So
Okay.
we have recipe collections from the late 13th century, but my friend Faith Wallace from McGill University kind of discovered this suite of recipes. There's about 11 or 12 of them for sauces for different types of meat in a manuscript that used to belong to Durham Cathedral, now in Cambridge. And she and I went through this, and yep, it's a set of gastronomic recipes, again in the middle of a medical collection, but it includes these sauces.
So it'll be good for us as well.
So yes, it should be.
Good, good. Okay, so I've got some herbs here, which I'm going to pound up. What have we got?
Yeah, so we've got creeping thyme, we have southernwood, we have sage, we have a mixture of hyssop and savoury, winter savoury, and we have some ale cost. Now, these recipes are really just lists of ingredients. So as you get later in the Middle Ages, you get more instruction on what to do, how to chop up things. Not very much on heat, because temperature is a little bit hit and miss.
Right.
There's no accurate way of doing it.
Yep.
But you do get more instruction on exactly how to do things. These early recipes, it's simply take a list of herbs, slake them with vinegar, and then you put this with a particular type of meat. But this recipe calls specifically for 2 bay leaves. So why it specifies 2, I don't know.
It's important.
But clearly it was very important.
Okay.
So we're going to pound all of those up, and then we're going to add, as the recipe suggests, vinegar. We've chosen a balsamic vinegar just because it gives you a little bit more body.
We're in a posh restaurant.
That's right. We're going to add some mustard. Our chef decided that capers would go nicely with it. That's an addition to the medieval recipe.
No, that made it worse.
Our chef decided we're going to go with capers. That's
Yes.
an addition to the medieval recipe, but it still has that nice tangy acidic flavour, and then some garlic. Salt and pepper. Medieval recipes very rarely tell you to add salt, but that's because it's ubiquitous and that's that kind of assumed knowledge. So,
Righto.
and pepper as well. Lots of different types of pepper available in the Middle Ages, not just our peppercorns, but long pepper, which is a wonderful.
And would any of those be grown in Britain?
No, these are all imported, so this
Right.
is in India in the main.
India. Wow, it's come a long way.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I will hand you over to our cookery school chef, Anthony, who's
Right.
going to take you through the process, and you can make it.
Grand. We're going to be cooking this. What is it?
This is a pork galantine.
What is it?
It's basically pork. It's pork loin, so very tender meat. And what we do is we bash it out really thin, and then you can roll it up with all different kinds of fillings. So in this case, we've actually got even more pork that we've chopped and minced up, and we've added some seasoning, some flavourings in there. It could use any sort of stuffing really, but in this
It
case.
looks very anatomical around the outside here. What's going on?
Yes, so this lace out on the outside, this is known as Cole's fat, or sometimes known as lace fat. And what it is, it's a sort of internal lining around the organs of cows or pigs. And it's basically, you can use it as a casing for things like sausages, or in this case, pork galantine.
Okay. Pork galantine.
The recipes are for various types of meat, so sauces to go with pork, with sausages, with tiny little whitebait. This
Right.
one is for ram, so we think it's a wether ram, which is a castrated male about 3 to 4 years old. Is
Okay,
what we think
because everyone I know who's ever had a go at eating a ram that still is testicularly intact has said they've been extremely uncomplimentary about the taste. I think like a jockstrap is the commonest descriptor, although how they would know that, I don't know. But today mutton has gone completely out of fashion in Britain.
Yep.
We used to eat loads of it.
Yep.
So these rams were kept for their meat, having been castrated before puberty, presumably. So
Presumably. So I mean,
Okay.
a hogget is a 1 to 2 year old, and then you get, but these are thought to be the best and highest quality of mutton, is the wether ram.
Okay, so they're not kept for breeding, they're kept just for meat.
Yep.
and they did it a lot, so presumably it was nice, but I'm yet ever to try it. So, first thing is mash up the herbs, is that right?
Yes, we're going to pound the herbs, so we've got a nice little mixture of herbs here from our garden.
All together, all at once?
All together, all in the hot tub.
Ready. Right. Circular motion like this, or is it more of a...
Circular motion, you can do a mixture of pounding and circular motion.
Okay, now at the moment, I have to say, visually, not a lot seems to be happening here.
The thing with pestling and mortaring, or really with grinding, the thing with grinding is that it does take a bit of work, a bit of time. People often don't expect that.
There's a heck of a smell coming off this.
Yep.
The inside of this mortar is not very gritty, not particularly rough, so...
Yeah, it's not the roughest. You can get rougher.
And you're going to tell me when I'm getting close.
Yep. So I reckon probably another 30 seconds or so, I think.
Okay. It's all coming together in a big lump now as well.
And you see we're getting quite a wet mixture now as well, so I think we're pretty much close.
Yeah, it's quite a dark green now.
Yeah. I think that's good, yeah?
Okay. Now what? Oh, wait a minute, was that one to go in?
Oh, rosemary, yes. So we kept the rosemary separate because we want to strip the leaves away from the stem. We don't want that woody stem in there. You'll be grinding away for hours actually if you leave that stem in there, so we just want the leaves for this.
So that stem.
Yep.
If you were doing this today to serve to modern customers, you would then transfer this to a modern whizzy machine, would you, and get it much finer?
Yes, so a food processor or a food chopper or something like that would do quite a good job. There is an argument for using a pestle and mortar. Obviously this is the most classic way of doing things. Some people do say that the flavour is different when you process it in a pestle and mortar. Some say that you can't really tell the difference whether it's you use a food processor or not.
There was one incredibly stubborn leaf that just...
We'll discard that.
So maybe that one has got a bit of stem in it. Right, so I now have a dark green paste.
Lovely. We're going to make that even more pasty. We're going to add in some slightly wetter ingredients this time. We'll have some capers here, which are pickled flower buds. Not many people realise that. But they have a lovely flavour, nice briny taste as well.
Right, that's one of the main ingredients of tartar sauce, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And it's going to add some salt to this as well, because these are normally preserved in brine or packed in salt. That's going to add a nice salty heft to this.
Right, chuck them all in?
Yeah, put them all in.
I'll just add them, okay.
And also a bit of sea salt as well. So this is mulled and flaked sea salt. And because this is flaked, actually, it's going to act as an abrasive, so it's going to help to break down things even more.
Handy.
So we're going to add some salt in. Very much a matter of taste, but we will just put a little bit in just to help things along.
Grand.
There you go.
Okay, anything else to go in yet?
Some mustard. Let's grab a teaspoon.
Now, I saw on one of the recipes, it said Dijon mustard.
Dijon mustard, that's right.
Right, so is this Dijon mustard?
This is Dijon mustard.
So this has wine in it?
I believe so. I'm not too sure what the difference is with
Well,
Dijon mustard.
as I understand it, Dijon was a wine-producing region of France that got its reputation for mustard production, which came second. So they had all this byproducts of the winemaking industry, and they thought, well, let's add it to mustard, and that can become our thing. And it became a style of mustard from the region.
Wow.
Is what I've been led to believe.
I'll have to check the container.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm wondering if...
So with Dijon mustard, this is going to add some piquancy as well. And I'm sure it will have had some sort of medicinal benefit as well using mustard.
Oh, absolutely. My goodness.
There you go.
Right, and we'll stick the garlic in later, yeah?
Garlic will pop in now, I think.
Okay.
So I'm just going to loosen the skins off these.
There's quite a different sound effect.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to feed you some garlic. There you go.
Okay, and there is an idea that's long established that the French would cook with garlic and the British wouldn't, and as I understand it, this is absolute nonsense. I've even read that the French habit of cooking with garlic was something that they got off the English. Garlic grows wild in Britain. There's a park not far from here, you'll probably know it, Jesmond-Dean.
Yes.
At certain times of the year, my goodness, that smells strongly of garlic.
Yeah.
With all the wild garlic growing there, yeah. So there's nothing French about sticking a bit of garlic in. This is a posh restaurant, so it has to be balsamic vinegar, obviously.
Any vinegar would be fine, I imagine. Something dark or red wine, cherry vinegar would be great.
Okay. And then the olive oil would have come over in barrels, presumably in this period, in the 12th, 13th century, from somewhere in Europe, in the form of already pressed oil.
I'm going to just feed in some olive oil. And the recipe suggests maybe 100 mils that we use here. 100 mils is very much a guideline. You can always go for a little bit more.
That's ridiculous. I mean, they didn't have mills in the medieval period, so that's...
A tenth of a quart.
This definitely reminds me of pesto.
Yeah? You've done a good job at this, actually. Have you done this before? Pasta and
No.
water? No? Now, don't be alarmed if it doesn't taste good at this point, because we can add seasonings,
Right.
sugar as well. We'll also treat as a seasoning for this.
Well, it's got quite a kick to it.
Yeah?
It's nice. It's yeah, very savoury, very it's quite stringent actually.
Yeah.
Very tangy.
Mm-hmm.
I really like it. And it also, yes, I wish most of the pesto sauces that I buy from supermarkets tasted like that.
Yeah.
Most of them are bland. This is way nicer.
So you can add a little bit of pepper if you like.
It's all ready, but all right, just because
Yeah.
you've bothered to get it here, I'll put a tiny bit in, but really, it's pretty nice.
It will darken a little bit over the next coming days, but it will keep quite well actually for probably about 5 days in the fridge.
The bay leaves.
Yes.
My mother always put the bay leaves in the hole and made absolutely sure that we took them out again, because she definitely was under the impression that they were not good for you. And okay, now I'm applying the pestle and mortar, which appears to be doing nothing.
Yep,
at
so
all.
if they're sliding around a little bit, what we'll do is we'll add some salt as an abrasive, so just a little bit, it'll just something a bit coarse. But actually,
Well, that
so-
salt has made a huge difference, and it's now very finely
Yeah,
minced up, although it's
That's fine.
also quite thoroughly stuck to the bottom of the mortar.
yeah. So because they've ground it quite well actually, it very much depends on the bay leaves. It depends how old the bay leaves are. Sometimes they become quite tough and woody. Sometimes they can be very, very soft.
We've been using pestle and mortar a bit interchangeably. This bit's the pestle, and the thing you grind it in is the mortar. Right, cooking. Now then, this is a modern oven. Clearly this is a modern oven. And whilst we were discussing this, it was referred to as roasting. This is not roasting, okay? This is not roasting. Just think, right, you get some dough, you knead it, you stick it into a baking tray, and then you stick the baking tray into the oven, and you bake it. And then you get another baking tray, and you put your chicken in, and you put the stuffing in the chicken and so forth, and you put that into an oven as well, and you're still baking it, heating something up in hot air inside an enclosed space. That's baking. Roasting is something quite different. Roasting was a very, very expensive, high-class thing, because you build up a big, roaring fire, and almost all the heat from it would go hurtling up the chimney, and it was just the radiant heat from the flames which cooked the thing. In the movies, they often put the pig or whatever it is over the flames. No, that's just how to burn a pig. You put it next to the flames, and the radiant heat would then slowly cook it using just a tiny bit of the energy. So it was very wasteful and very expensive and very high class. And so kings would have servants turning the spits, and they would roast at the big grand feasts and so forth. What your mum does on a Sunday with the chicken is baking.
I'll have to come back next week, we'll roast a cake.
Ooh, bubbly, bubbly.
So often when you slice something that comes straight out the oven, you get a lot of juice and moisture. It can actually make it a bit hard to carve. So imagine a roast chicken straight out the oven.
Okay.
You try and slice it thinly, it's just going to be a bit slushy almost. So if you let your chicken rest about 10-15 minutes, it just makes it much easier to carve.
I don't have the patience.
Sometimes neither do I. So would you like to do the honours?
Righto, here we go then.
There you go.
So, scoop around. There you go.
Oh.
But this is a high-class restaurant, so
There we go.
we have to not get it on the plate, because that would just ruin everything. We get some geometrical precision on the top here.
Lovely.
Come on then, expert. Get in here, and one for you as well.
Thank you very much.
Right, so this should be tender enough to fall apart.
Should be.
At all. Oh, there we go. Marvellous.
lovely.
Okay. Well, that shut us up, didn't it? That is really nice. It's I can taste the vinegar. I can taste. I can't taste any one dominant herb. It's a sort of a
Harmony.
General herb
Yeah.
harmony. Okay, it's one of those.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's as good a version of that as I've tasted.
Really? Get in. Right, what we're doing next?
We're going to roast a cake next.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll turn the spit.
lovely.